My daughter forged my signature and sold our family's company to our greatest rival. So I became a shadow on the boardroom wall, until the day I took my seat back at the head of the table, and she realized the price of betrayal was everything she ever wanted. Let me tell you how everything unfolded. First, let me quickly thank you for your continuous support. This means a lot to us. If you enjoy the stories we share, kindly subscribe to this channel. It will be great if you can leave a comment on which city you are watching from. We might just give you a shout out in our next story. Today's special shout out goes to Daniel Kamen from Oklahoma. We are glad you enjoy our stories. Now let's go deeper into the story. My name is Thomas Reed, and I built my life out of silence and steel. I spent 30 years turning a modest family-run workshop into an empire of precision. Reed & Sons Manufacturing, known for the kind of machinery that outlives the men who build it. I was proud of it, proud of the way my name looked carved in brass at the factory gates. But none of that mattered the morning I learned my daughter had signed it all away. I still remember the boardroom's hush, how it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. My daughter, Charlotte, sat there in a crisp navy blazer, her hair coiled at her nape like she thought she could hold back the chaos with a hairpin. She was 28 years old, but in that moment, she looked older than me. She didn't look at me once, not even when I walked in and saw the rival company's lawyers sliding that final document across the polished table. Betrayal isn't a word you ever expect to taste in your own blood, but I did that morning. It was bitter and metallic, and it settled in my chest like a stone I couldn't swallow. I didn't say a word when I saw my name forged in that signature. I didn't rage or threaten, though God knows every part of me was screaming to stand and tear that contract to pieces. Instead, I sat down in the chair that had been mine for decades, a quiet observer at the table that used to bend to my voice. My daughter's hand was shaking as she signed the last page, but she kept her eyes steady on the lawyer's smile, like she couldn't afford to see me breaking beside her. She didn't see the way the rival CEO smirked, didn't see how that small curl of his lips said everything, that he had won, that she had been his pawn and didn't even know it. I watched her lift her pen and set it down again, watched her fingers flex once, twice, like she was trying to wake up from a dream that was already real. You ever been in that kind of silence? The kind where your whole world goes mute, but inside your head, the noise is deafening? I want to tell you I saw it coming, that I was wise enough to read the small betrayals that always lead to the final cut. But the truth is, I saw everything except the one thing that mattered. In the weeks leading up to that day, Charlotte had been distant, polite in that clipped way that tells you she's not listening anymore. She'd grown up in that boardroom, sitting at my side, learning the language of balance sheets and backroom deals like it was the only way to love me. Maybe that was my first mistake, teaching her that power was love, that to hold a seat at that table was the same as holding my hand. She took that lesson and turned it into a weapon I never saw coming. And even as I sat there, watching the ink dry on the contract that would steal everything I'd built, a part of me wanted to believe she was still my little girl. But love doesn't mean anything when loyalty dies. The boardroom was cold that morning, though it was June and the city was already burning up with the heat of summer. Sunlight slanted through the high windows, turning the grain of the table into rivers of light and shadow. I remember every detail of that room because it's the last time I let myself be blind. My father's chair, mine now, was pushed back from the table, like it was already empty. I could feel the chill of the leather against my palms as I sat down, steadying myself, refusing to let them see how my hands wanted to shake. The rival CEO, a man named Mark Devlin, was all soft smiles and measured tones, his voice a dagger wrapped in velvet. He didn't gloat, not openly. That wasn't his way. But every time his eyes met mine, I felt the weight of it, like he was savoring the moment he'd waited years for. And Charlotte? She never once looked at me, not even as she slid that final document across the table with hands that couldn't hide the tremor. I wish I could tell you I said something clever, some final line that would brand itself into her memory. But I didn't. My voice had always been my weapon, but that day it deserted me. Instead, I let the silence speak for me. I let her see the weight of it in my eyes, the way betrayal doesn't shout, it whispers. It was only later, in the long hours of the night when I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, that I realized that kind of silence can cut deeper than any words. She thought she was doing what needed to be done, I'm sure of that. She'd grown tired of being my shadow, tired of carrying a name that never really felt like hers. I know that now. But knowing doesn't make it hurt less. And it doesn't make it right. That morning, as they walked out of the boardroom, I stayed seated. Charlotte paused by the door, like she might turn back, like she might say my name. But she didn't. She left with the rival, the man who'd spent years waiting for me to stumble. And I sat there in that empty room, surrounded by the ghosts of every decision I'd ever made, every risk I'd ever taken for the sake of a family that was already breaking apart. I didn't move for a long time, just watched the dust motes dance in the sunbeams, feeling the weight of every choice that had led me to that moment. It was in that silence that I realized I wasn't just losing the company. I was losing her. I want you to understand something, because this is where the story begins, not where it ends. In that moment, I didn't feel rage. Not yet. What I felt was something colder, something that slipped through the cracks in my heart and pooled there in the dark. I felt the quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after the storm has passed, and the wreckage is all that's left. The kind that tells you the only way to survive is to vanish into it. So I did. I left the boardroom that morning with nothing but my name and a promise I made to myself. A promise I didn't speak out loud. Because the thing about betrayal is this, it never really ends. It just goes underground, waiting for the moment you're ready to drag it back into the light. After that morning in the boardroom, I disappeared from the world that had been mine. I didn't pack a suitcase or write a farewell letter. I simply walked out of that building and let the city swallow me whole. I had spent my life carving out my place in those boardrooms, my name, my presence, the weight of my voice. And then, in the span of a single morning, I became a ghost haunting my own legacy. I didn't go home to the penthouse where Charlotte's laughter used to echo down the hallways. I didn't answer the calls that buzzed in my pocket, not even when I saw her name flash on the screen. Instead, I drove west until the city was just a smudge in the rearview mirror, until the only sound was the hum of the tires on the cracked asphalt and the low thrum of my thoughts. I ended up at the cabin on the lake, a place I hadn't been in years, a place that still smelled of old cedar and wood smoke. It was my father's cabin once, though he'd never seen it as anything but a tax write-off. To me, it had always been the one place that felt like it belonged to no one else. The water was still and dark, a mirror that didn't lie. I spent the first night there in silence, sitting on the narrow porch and watching the moon climb above the pines. My phone kept ringing, each call a reminder of the world I'd left behind. I let it ring out every time, the shrill chirp of it cutting through the hush like a blade. And then, after a while, even the phone gave up. The silence settled over me like a shroud, and I let it. The next morning, I woke to the smell of pine needles and the damp breath of the lake drifting through the open window. I didn't make coffee. I didn't shave. I didn't do any of the small things that had once been my armor. Instead, I sat at the old kitchen table, the one with the knife marks from years of careless chopping and the ring stains from my father's whiskey. I ran my fingers over the scars in the wood and thought about how everything we build, everything we touch, carries a memory of us, even if we're not there to see it anymore. My thoughts kept circling back to Charlotte, how she must have felt signing that contract, what she must have told herself to make it right. I wanted to hate her. I wanted to hold on to that hate because it was easier than admitting how deep the wound really went. But sitting there in the quiet, I realized I couldn't hate her. Not yet. Because hating her meant I'd have to let go of every good thing I ever saw in her. The days blurred together at the cabin, each one folding into the next like the pages of a book I didn't want to read. I fished the lake in the mornings, not because I wanted to eat what I caught, but because I needed to feel the line go taut in my hands, the small tug of something alive on the other end. I chopped wood in the afternoons, splitting logs until my shoulders burned and the sweat stung my eyes. At night, I sat by the fire and watched the embers glow like dying stars. There was a comfort in that rhythm, a kind of absolution in the mindless work. I didn't think about the company or the boardroom. I didn't think about Mark Devlin and the way he'd smiled across the table. I didn't even think about Charlotte's eyes, the way they'd looked past me like I was already gone. At least, that's what I told myself. But the truth is, I did think about her. Every hour, every minute. I thought about the nights when she was a little girl, and I'd read her bedtime stories by the light of a cracked lamp. I thought about how she used to curl up beside me on the couch, her head on my shoulder, asking questions about the world that only a child could ask. I thought about how I'd spent so many years teaching her how to be strong, but never how to be gentle. How to take, but not how to give back. Those thoughts were the worst kind of punishment. They hollowed me out in a way no corporate takeover ever could. And in that hollow space, I started to see the shape of what I had to become. I didn't know it yet, not fully. But something in me shifted in those long, quiet days. I started to see the outlines of a plan, not the kind of plan you write down on paper, but the kind that grows in the dark corners of your mind. I started to remember every small slight, every overlooked detail in the company's bylaws, every old favor that had never been repaid. I had spent my life learning how to read the room, how to let the silence do my speaking for me. Now, I would let that same silence become my shield. Because if there's one thing betrayal teaches you, it's that you can't fight a war out in the open. You have to become a shadow, something they can't see until it's too late. I didn't call anyone in those weeks. Not the old friends who'd once sat at my table, not the lawyers who would have fallen over themselves to carry my flag. I needed to be alone with my thoughts, to let them settle and take shape. And in that solitude, I found something I hadn't expected, a kind of clarity. I realized that if I was going to take back what was mine, if I was going to make her understand the weight of what she'd done, I couldn't do it with rage. Rage burns fast and bright, but it leaves nothing but ash. I needed something colder, something that would last. I needed patience. And so I waited. And while I waited, I planned. The first step was to let her forget me. Let her believe I was broken, that I'd retreated for good. Let Mark Devlin think he'd won, that my silence was surrender and not strategy. I knew the company would be in turmoil. There's no such thing as a clean takeover, no matter how careful the signatures. I knew Charlotte would feel that pressure, would start to see the cracks forming in the foundation she'd built on my name. And when she did, when she realized that the man she'd sold us out to was never going to treat her as an equal, that's when I would come back. Not as the man she betrayed, but as the man she never saw coming. The days turned into weeks, and in the slow rhythm of that quiet cabin, I began to gather the fragments of the man I had been and build something sharper, something more precise. I didn't feel like Thomas Reed, patriarch and founder, not anymore. That man had died the day Charlotte signed my name away. What remained was something else, something that understood that survival isn't about winning. It's about refusing to let them see you bleed. And I refused to let them see me bleed, not one drop. I told myself that every log I split, every fish I caught, every hour spent in the silent company of the trees was another piece of armor, another layer of quiet resolve. The world had always been a game of patience and leverage. I had just forgotten that somewhere along the way. I started reading again. Not the newspapers or the trade journals that had once dictated the rhythm of my days, but the old family ledgers I'd stored in the cabin's loft, dusty tomes of balance sheets and hand-scrawled notes from decades past. My father's handwriting in the margins, my own additions in red ink from the early years. They were more than numbers. They were the record of every risk, every near failure that had made the company strong. I traced those lines with my fingers like a priest reading scripture, remembering the lessons I'd once thought I was too clever to need. And in those pages, I found the seeds of the plan I would grow. Because the company wasn't just a business, it was a living thing, and I knew every nerve and bone in its body. At night, I spread those ledgers across the kitchen table, mapping out the players and the pieces. I made lists of allies who owed me favors. Men and women who'd built their own empires on the quiet loans I'd given them, the whispered support I'd offered when no one else would. I wrote their names in a notebook, one by one, like a litany of debts waiting to be called in. I thought about Mark Devlin and the way he had always circled my company like a vulture, patient and silent, waiting for the moment to swoop in. I thought about Charlotte, how she must have believed she was saving us, or saving herself. But I knew better. The world doesn't reward mercy, and it sure as hell doesn't reward sentiment. It only rewards those who understand that power is never given. It's taken. The phone stayed off, tucked in the bottom drawer of the kitchen like a relic from another life. I didn't want to hear her voice, not yet. I needed the distance. I needed the silence to grow roots deep enough to hold me steady. Instead, I started to make calls from the old rotary phone in the cabin. calls that couldn't be traced, conversations that didn't leave a record, old friends who owed me more than they cared to admit. Quiet deals struck in the half-light of memory and loyalty. I told them I wasn't coming back to the city, not yet. But I let them hear the calm in my voice, the steel beneath the quiet. I let them know I wasn't done. And they understood, because men like me don't vanish. We just go underground. The transformation wasn't about becoming someone else. It was about becoming the man I had been before the weight of the company and the family and the endless expectations dulled my edges. I started to see every conversation, every transaction as a game of leverage again. I found the thrill in it, the old hunger that had driven me when I was young and reckless and sure I could outlast anyone. I wasn't reckless anymore, but I was sure, and that was enough. In the long hours between dusk and dawn, I rehearsed the conversations I would have when I came back. Not with words, but with the quiet weight of my presence. Because I knew now that the only way to take back what had been stolen was to remind them all who I had always been. There was one night, late, when the moon was just a thin slice of light over the water, when I sat on the porch with the old family ledger in my lap. I let the pages fall open to the section where I'd first written down the mission statement for Reed and Sons, to outlast and outwork anyone who would take what is ours. My father's words, but in my handwriting. I traced them with my thumb and felt the old fire stirring in my chest, the one I thought I'd buried under decades of compromise. I thought about how Charlotte must have felt when she signed that contract. Whether she'd remembered those words or if she'd convinced herself they didn't matter anymore. But I knew better. I knew that the only thing that ever matters is the promise you make to yourself when no one else is listening. In that quiet, I started to sketch out the real plan. It wouldn't be enough to come back and fight her head on. She'd expect that. She'd be ready for it. No. What I needed was to let her think she'd won, to let her believe that the company was hers now, that I was just a ghost in the margins of her success. I needed to let her build her castle on the sand, to watch as the tide I'd been summoning rose up around her. And when the water reached her feet, when she finally looked around and realized the ground was gone, that's when I'd step back into the light. Not as her father, but as the man she never really understood. I didn't know how long it would take. Weeks, months, it didn't matter. Because the thing about revenge is that it's not about speed. It's about precision. It's about waiting for the moment when your silence is the loudest voice in the room. So I waited. I watched the lake and the trees and the stars wheel overhead, and I told myself that every breath I took was one step closer to that moment. And when it came, I would be ready, because I wasn't going back to take my seat at the table. I was going back to remind them all that it had always been mine. I came back to the city in the dead of winter, when the air turned to glass and the streets were muffled under a hush of frost. I didn't tell anyone I was coming back. I didn't owe that to anyone. My arrival was as quiet as the betrayal that had driven me away. I walked into that cold, gray skyline like a man who'd never left, but I didn't go home. Home wasn't the penthouse with its gleaming views and empty halls. It wasn't the echo of my name in the marble floors of the headquarters. Home was the space I carried inside me now, the space I'd carved out in the silence of the cabin, the space that didn't need anyone else to recognize it. And that was the only place I needed to be. I found a small apartment in an old brick building on the edge of the city, the kind of place no one would look for me. The elevator creaked, the paint peeled in the stairwell, but it was enough. I didn't need luxury. I needed anonymity. I furnished the apartment with just what I needed. A narrow bed, a battered armchair, a table where I could spread out the ledgers and plans that had become my compass. At night, the city lights glowed through the thin curtains, a constant reminder of the world I was slipping back into. But I didn't feel like I was returning to the city I'd known. I felt like I was returning to a battleground I'd already claimed, long before they ever thought to take it from me. I didn't call Charlotte. I didn't tell her I was back. I let her learn it the way the city learns a storm is coming, through whispers and small signs that she couldn't quite trace. I started with the small players first, the ones whose loyalty I'd never needed to question. I bought back shares through shell companies, never in my own name, never with my fingerprints on the deal. The men I called in those favors to, men who owed me decades of quiet loyalty, they didn't ask why. They understood. In the world we built, debts aren't paid with money. They're paid with silence and loyalty and the quiet understanding that some things are bigger than pride. I watched the numbers shift, felt the ground beneath the boardroom tilt in my direction, one share at a time. And through it all, I never let her see me coming. I'd visit the headquarters in the early mornings, slipping in before the staff had even turned on the lights. I'd stand in the hallway outside the boardroom and let my reflection stare back at me in the glass. An old man, maybe, but not a broken one. I'd watch the way the sun rose through those tall windows, turning the steel and glass into fire. I wanted to feel what it meant to take it back, inch by inch. I wanted to feel the pulse of it beneath my feet again. And when I walked those halls, I didn't see the betrayal anymore. I saw the shape of what I was reclaiming. I saw the company as it had always been, mine. I ran into Mark Devlin once in the lobby. He didn't recognize me at first. He was too busy talking into his phone, that same smooth voice that had stolen my company with a single smile. When he finally saw me, there was a flicker of surprise in his eyes, just for a moment. He covered it well, but I saw it. That flash of doubt, that small fracture in the confidence he wore like armor. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The silence between us was enough. It told him everything he needed to know. I wasn't gone. I wasn't done. And I wasn't going to let him keep what was mine. Charlotte didn't see me that day, but I knew she would soon. I could feel the pressure building around her, the small cracks in the foundation she tried so hard to hold together. I heard the whispers from the staff, the tension in the meetings she'd shared in my absence. She was good at playing the part, but she'd learned the game from me. And I knew better than anyone that the game isn't won by those who shout the loudest. It's won by those who can stand in the quiet and let everyone else feel the weight of it. And that was the part she'd never understood. That was the part that would be her undoing. In the weeks that followed, I kept moving like a shadow through those halls. I didn't announce my return. I didn't demand a seat at the table. I let them see me in glimpses, an old ghost haunting the edges of their conversations. And in those glimpses, I planted doubt. Doubt in the men who'd once called me mentor. Doubt in the rivals who thought they could replace me. Doubt in Charlotte, who would come to realize that the man she'd pushed away wasn't gone. He was just waiting for the moment when the silence would be louder than any boardroom speech. There was a night I won't forget, late, when the city was a black sea of lights and the world felt like it was holding its breath. I stood on the roof of the headquarters, looking out at the skyline. The cold bit at my skin, but I didn't feel it. I thought about how the city had changed in my absence, how the people inside those buildings would never know the war that was being fought in the quiet spaces between meetings and signatures. And in that moment, I felt something shift in me. I wasn't the man who'd been betrayed anymore. I was the man who was going to take it all back. I didn't know how long it would take. I didn't care. Because every step I took, every small move I made, was a promise to myself. A promise that the seat at the head of the table was mine, and I would take it back not with rage, but with the quiet certainty of a man who has already lost everything and has nothing left to fear. And in that quiet, in that resolve, I found a kind of peace. Because the thing about silence is this: it can be the most powerful voice in the room if you know how to use it. And I had learned that lesson better than anyone. The morning I walked back into the boardroom, the air was heavy with the scent of polished wood and quiet panic. I didn't make an entrance. I didn't need to. I let the door's soft click announce me, and when they turned to see who had arrived, I let the silence settle over them like a velvet blade. Charlotte was at the head of the table, her hand gripping the chair's edge, knuckles white against the dark leather. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. And in that hush, I felt the weight of every choice, every betrayal, every whispered secret that had brought us here. I stepped forward, slow and deliberate, my eyes on her face. And in that moment, she understood. She saw that this was not a negotiation. This was a reckoning. Mark Devlin was there, of course, his mouth already half curled into that smug, careful smile. But it faltered when he met my gaze. I didn't say his name. I didn't even look at him again. My focus was on Charlotte, because this was her moment as much as it was mine. She opened her mouth to speak, to call some kind of order to the meeting, but the words caught in her throat. I didn't give her a chance to find them. I took my seat at the table, the one that had always been mine, no matter whose name was on the paperwork, and let the hush do the talking for me. The board shifted in their seats, eyes darting between me and the woman who had once been my little girl. I saw the questions in their eyes, the fear. I let them feel it. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm and low, like a confession whispered in the dark. "This is my table," I said. "It was built with my name, my blood, and today, I'm taking it back." No one dared to interrupt. The room was so still I could hear the faint hum of the city beyond the glass. I laid out the documents, proof of my silent buybacks, the small stakes I'd reclaimed piece by piece. Each page was a silent rebuke, a reminder that I had never truly been gone. Mark Devlin leaned forward, his voice smooth as he tried to find the cracks in my armor. "Thomas, this isn't how business is done," he said, his tone almost gentle. I let the words hang in the air, a hollow echo of a man who thought he could still control the narrative. I turned to him then, just for a moment. "This isn't business," I said. "This is survival. And I've been surviving longer than you've been playing this game." His mouth opened, but I didn't let him speak again. I shifted my gaze back to Charlotte. "You signed my name," I said, my voice soft, but each word carved out of iron. "You thought that meant you could take my place. But you were wrong. My name isn't ink on a contract. It's the bones of this company, and you can't take that from me." She flinched, just a flicker of pain in her eyes, and for a heartbeat, I almost faltered. Almost. She tried to speak then, her voice trembling just enough for me to hear it. "I thought I was saving us," she said, her words catching on the edge of regret. "I thought he'd protect what we built, but I cut her off, not with anger, but with the kind of quiet that says more than any shout." "No one protects what you're willing to sell," I said. "Not even you." The room seemed to contract around us then, the air thick with the unspoken truth that had been waiting to be acknowledged. She looked down at the table, her hands shaking. And in that moment, I saw the child she used to be, the girl who had once believed her father's word was law, the girl who had once trusted me to keep her safe. But that girl was gone, and the woman who sat in her place had chosen her own path. Mark tried to interject again, his voice a low purr of diplomacy. "We can work this out," he said. "There's no need for theatrics, Thomas." I let my gaze linger on him, not with anger, but with something colder. "You don't get to decide how this ends," I said. "Not anymore." I let the weight of that settle, the finality of it. Because this wasn't about deals or negotiations. This was about reclaiming what had been stolen and making sure they both understood the cost of that theft. And as I sat there, the silence filling every corner of the room, I saw the realization dawn in Charlotte's eyes. She understood, finally, that the price of betrayal was everything she had ever wanted. The rest of the meeting unfolded in a blur of signatures and silences. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. The paperwork had already been done, the shares already mine. All that was left was the formal surrender, the final recognition of a truth they could no longer deny. When the last document was signed, I stood. Charlotte stayed seated, her eyes fixed on the table, her face pale and still. I wanted to say something to her then, something that would bridge the chasm between us. But there were no words left that could fix what she had broken. So I turned and walked out, leaving her in the hush of that room, the echo of my footsteps the only sound. Outside, the city was the same as it had always been, cold and bright, indifferent to the wars we fight behind glass walls. I stood on the steps of the building, breathing in the winter air, and for the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. Not because I had won. Victory in this kind of war is always hollow. But because I had reclaimed the one thing that could never be taken from me, the quiet certainty that I had survived. And in that survival, I had become something stronger than the man they thought they could break. I had become the silence itself. Unbreakable, unspoken, and utterly beyond their reach. The days after the confrontation were a blur of headlines and whispered rumors. The boardroom power plays, the abrupt resignation of Mark Devlin, the hushed conversations in the corners of the office, I watched it all from a distance. I didn't need to stand at the head of the table anymore. The battle was over, and the silence that followed was my final victory. I spent those first days not in the office, but in the small apartment I'd claimed as my own. I let the city's noise wash over me through the thin walls, the rumble of traffic and the hum of a world that didn't know my name or my story. In that anonymity, I found something I hadn't expected, a kind of freedom. I saw Charlotte only once after that day in the boardroom. She came to the apartment unannounced, her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes hollow and searching. She didn't knock. She just stood in the doorway, as if she wasn't sure she was allowed to step inside. I let her come in. I didn't say anything, didn't offer her a seat. I just stood there, my hands resting on the back of the chair I'd claimed as mine in this small, quiet space. She looked at me like she was trying to find the father she'd known, the man she'd once believed would never let her down. But I was done being that man. Or maybe I'd never been him at all. "I didn't mean for it to be this way," she said, her voice small and tired. "I thought if I did this, if I took control, you'd be proud of me." There was no anger in her voice, no defiance, just a kind of weary regret that sounded older than both of us. I let her words settle between us, like dust in the pale morning light. And then I spoke, my voice as quiet as the day she signed my name away. "Pride is a luxury we lost a long time ago, Charlotte. All that's left now is the truth." She flinched at that, just a little, but she didn't look away. She asked me if I would ever forgive her. She said it in a whisper, like she was afraid the walls might hear. And I told her the only thing I could. "Forgiveness isn't something you can earn or demand," I said. "It's something you live with, or without." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. And for a moment, just a moment, I saw the little girl she used to be. The one who'd climb onto my lap and beg for just one more story. I wanted to tell her that I still loved her, that love doesn't vanish just because trust does. But the words felt too heavy in my mouth, so I let them stay inside. Some things are better left unsaid. When she left, I stood at the window and watched her walk away. She didn't look back, and I didn't expect her to. Because in the end, the real victory wasn't in reclaiming the company or outmaneuvering Mark Devlin. The real victory was in reclaiming myself, the quiet certainty that I had survived everything they'd thrown at me, and come out the other side with my soul still intact. I knew that forgiveness would come, if it ever did, in its own time. And until then, I would keep moving forward. Alone, maybe, but not broken. I went back to the headquarters once, weeks later, just to stand in the empty boardroom and let the quiet wash over me one last time. The city lights glittered through the tall windows, the skyline a jagged promise of everything that still lay ahead. I ran my fingers over the smooth surface of the table, feeling the cold grain of the wood beneath my palm. I thought about the years I'd spent fighting for that seat, the blood and sweat and silent sacrifices. And I realized that in the end, the chair had never been the point. It wasn't about power or pride or even the legacy of my name. It was about knowing who I was when the silence came and refusing to be anything less. As I left the building, I felt a kind of finality settle over me. Not peace. Peace is a fragile thing, easily broken by memory and regret, but something close to it. A quiet strength that didn't need anyone else's approval to exist. I walked out into the cold night air, the city sprawling before me like an endless horizon. And I knew that whatever came next, I was ready. Because in the end, the only thing that matters isn't what they take from you. It's what you refuse to let go of. And I would never let go of that quiet, unbreakable part of myself again. If you've ever found yourself fighting for something that no one else could see, then you know, silence can be the sharpest weapon you'll ever wield. If this story struck a chord, if you felt those echoes of betrayal and resolve in your own life, don't walk away just yet. I share stories like this all the time. Stories of quiet battles, of taking back what's yours, of finding your voice when the world tries to silence it. Hit that subscribe button. Stay with me. Let's walk through the quiet together. See you soon in the next one.